This week we're going to be learning about roughages and kind of getting an overview of what roughages are really about. They do make up a lot of the feeds we feed livestock, specifically our herbivore species like horses, cattle, sheep, etc. But today we're going to talk about defining what a roughage is. We're going to look at the strengths and weaknesses of some of our common roughages and talk about some factors that can affect feeding value or nutritive value of these roughages. Initially, it's important to make sure we're very clear about what we're defining. And a roughage, remember from last week, is anything that's considered over 18% crude fiber. So they're high fiber feeds. As a result, they're usually not as digestible and available to an animal as some of the other classes of feeds when we're talking about the concentrates. There's three general types of roughages that we deal with. A forage is an example, that is the total plant material available to be consumed by an animal. This could come in the form of grasslands, hay, or silage. Typically are the forages we'd see fed to animals. A roughage itself is a term just used to describe the feeds high in fiber, like that feed class of roughage. However, not all roughages are forage. I think I can safely say all forages are roughages, but not all roughages are forage. An example of a roughage source that provides high fiber in an animal's diet is cottonseed hulls, the outer hull of a cottonseed. However, that is not a forage. It's not a whole plant available to be consumed by an animal. Down in Florida, we actually used cottonseed hulls as our roughage source in feedlot rations, and it didn't have any hay in those rations, and it worked extremely well. The last term that we need to know is herbage, and that's just basically referring to the green plant material that doesn't include the seed or the roots that's being used as a food by herbivores. Pasture is a great example. Young green growing grasses that haven't seeded out is an example of herbage. If you get into a lot of grazing management, you'll talk about herbage mass and those types of things, meaning the pasture product. When we talk about roughages, they're bulky. That means they take up space and don't have a lot of weight to them. Let's do an example. If we were to, actually let's see if I can draw this out here where you can actually imagine this. And again, this is no laughing at Selena's drawings. But say we have two bins, okay, that are relatively equal size. We will again pretend that those are equal size, which we know they're not. If we were to put straw in one of them, and we were to put corn grain in the other one, which one do you think is heavier? Which one are we going to be able to get more pounds of feed, straw or corn, into which bucket? The heavier one is going to be the corn. And when you think about it, corn's going to be heavier because it's denser. It's going to pack more pounds, it's smaller particle size. We're going to be able to get a lot of corn in a 5-gallon bucket. It'll actually weigh almost 25 pounds to fill a bucket up with corn. Straw, on the other hand, is fluffier, isn't it? It's not as dense. You would really have to pack some straw in there to even come close to the weight of the corn. That's an example of bulky. If we were to take our little buckets or containers and visualize them as, say, the rumen of a cow, know that the roughage feeds, the high fiber feeds that are bulky, will take up more space in that rumen. And we just need to understand that concept because it does affect how we feed them. And so when we talk about that roughage as a bulky feed, it's a low weight per unit of volume. It takes up space. Typically roughages, in addition to being bulky, they're going to have less than 70% TDN. They're high fiber, low digestibility compared to our other classes, specifically protein supplements and energy feeds. And some of the most common examples are hay, silage, pasture, and rangeland. The university farm utilizes all of those. We have hay put up on our farm. We feed hay to all of our herbivore species. There's silage that is used at the beef and the dairy. All three of the herbivorous species have pasture land, and we even have 250 acres of rangeland north of town that's utilized by the beef cows. So we do utilize all those types of roughages. As we talk about roughages, we've got to have a good understanding of plant cell structure. And you may wonder, why do we even have to talk about this stuff? Well, it's important from a nutritional standpoint because various parts of the plant cells digest at different rates. So when we're feeding different species like cows and sheep and goats plant parts, we need to know how does that affect what's digested by them and what quality is getting into our animals. So we've got to understand plant cell structure. And there are numerous factors that affect forage quality. All of these factors, species of forage, temperature, maturity of the forage, leaf to stem ratio, fertilization, and even how we harvest it or store it can affect forage quality. And so when we're talking about understanding the plant cell wall and plant cell structure, there's three things you need to know about. One is, if we take a look at our schematic of a plant cell, and I'm going to change my color to red or something that should show up a little bit better. We have inside the cell what we call the cell contents. Things like protein, really soluble sugars and starch, some fats are located in there, and some pectins, which are an intermediate carbohydrate. As a general rule of thumb, the cell contents is highly digested. Where's my L's not working? When we think about cell contents, we think that they're highly digested, they're easily utilized by the animal, they're not very fibrous. Next, we need to consider the actual plant cell wall itself. And so if you notice here, we have a primary cell wall and a secondary cell wall. Plants are rigid. They require a lot of support. And we need to understand the shape of that cell wall. So down here on our diagram, we have a secondary in yellow and the primary cell wall in green. The total cell wall, the major components we need to think about are cellulose, lignin, and hemicellulose. The secondary cell wall is predominantly hemicellulose. The primary wall is cellulose and lignin. This primary wall right here is generally considered not digestible, or it's very poor in digestibility. The other one, the secondary wall, is somewhat intermediate in its digestibility, and so we need to understand what factors affect the development of this cell wall that could affect digestibility for our animals. We're going to talk a little bit more about these terms: acid detergent fiber. Let me clear out some of that writing there. Acid detergent fiber and neutral detergent fiber. I know that cut off a little bit, but that's what those two terms are. And it relates to the proportions of the soluble and insoluble cell wall components of a plant. And so that's why we need to understand what the cell contents are, what's in the primary cell wall, cellulose and lignin, and what's in the secondary cell wall, a lot of hemicellulose. Those affect digestibility of these forages. When we consider forages, one of the key concepts young stockmen need to develop and understand is that as a plant matures, okay, so we're talking maturity here. Consider this almost like a graph with maturity along the bottom axis. We're going to see an increase in forage yield. As plants mature, they get bigger, grow taller, up to a point. They will ultimately plateau off. However, in contrast to that, as plants mature, the quality from a standpoint of, think, protein, energy, etc., or digestibility, that quality is going to go down with maturity. And so as livestock producers, we are looking to try to capitalize on forage quality that optimizes yield and optimizes quality in especially grazing programs, or when we're harvesting like a hay for production. We want to get as much yield as we can, but we don't want to come too far out into the extreme of maturity and lose forage quality. So where is that sweet spot, so to say, that combines yield and quality? So just understand that as forage quality or forage maturity increases, yield is going to go up for the most part. However, we may see a negative relationship with maturity and the quality of that forage. So when we get into forage management, and you will in some other classes, that's a big topic, and it's very important as livestock managers to consider that relationship. This is going to wrap up the first part of the forages section. We're going to get ready to start a second part talking specifically about pastures and rangeland because they're so important in our grazing animal. So be sure to pick up on part 2.